Hello students. Here we are in week 31. We're getting near the end now, and today we'll be talking about the 50s, and I'll start introducing some of next week's lesson on the 60s. It's just so that next week's lecture isn't too long. I don't want to end on a really long lecture. So I kind of evened them out a little bit here. And that has to do with the fact that we missed that week, right? So I was having to squish some things together. All right, so we're going to start with the 50s right now, and we remember that Dwight Eisenhower, the hero of D-Day, was a military hero. We saw that last week that he was elected easily and became our 34th president. All right, so the 50s and the Eisenhower years are usually portrayed as an idyllic life. Everything's wonderful, everybody's happy, the war is over, it's all good. And furthermore, there was a big baby boom. If you've some people who were born before y'all, including me, would be considered baby boomers because we were born during this time, which was roughly the time of 1948 after the war till about 1963. So a pretty, big range there, but there were lots and lots of babies born. And the idea is that the guys come home for the war and the women are saying, life is so uncertain. We need to live life to the fullest. We need to have our babies and that kind of thing. People weren't waiting for having children and stuff like that. So now, of course, there's a big group of people. I'm in the young side of that group, but a large group of people called the boomers who are coming into the old age, and using Medicare and Medicaid and that kind of thing. So, but that's why, because after the war, there was a certain amount of optimism and a certain amount of, general fear about life is uncertain kind of a thing. And furthermore, even though the hot war was over, there was still a Cold War going on. Remember with Harry Truman, we talked about the Cold War between America and communist nations, namely the USSR, that's Russia. And Russia was building up nuclear arms. Remember, they had stolen the information on how to make a nuclear bomb from us, and they were making nuclear bombs. And so there was this kind of ramping up of who could have the most number of weaponry. And so we're going to see this rise to heights of great fear. And people had their own bomb shelters in their backyards. This one may have been actually underground. People thought that any time the Russians could drop a nuclear bomb on us. And the whole thing, they taught children duck and cover, getting under your desks at school and things like this. And so there was kind of this underlying fear, but yet also, optimism about the future as well. Kind of an unusual thing here. There were also domestic problems that Eisenhower faced, namely racial relations all over the country, but typically in the South with the Jim Crow thing and things like this. And so here we can see a group of people who are marching to say, we have been given equal rights and we want to keep our equal rights, as far as, the Civil War being ended and that kind of thing. And so they started demanding more instead of just sitting quietly. This is a woman who made a big difference. Her name is Rosa Parks, and she was living in Alabama. And she was someone who used the public a bus system. And there was a rule at the time on the buses that African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus. Now, if they could sit anywhere in the bus at the beginning, but if somebody else got on the bus, a white person got on the bus, then the black people would have to move to the back of the bus so that the white person could have a seat closer to the front. It really was a law there. And so finally, a group of politically minded African Americans who wanted to make this statement, they said, we've got to do something about this. Who is willing to, take the fall? And Rosa Parks said, I am. I'll do it. And so one day she's after work sitting in a seat that's nearer the front of the bus. A man came in, and the bus driver demanded that Rosa Parks leave her seat for the man, and she refused to leave. All right. And because of that, she got arrested, and then she was put in jail, and they used that case to bring about change. Okay, so this is going to happen several times where the African Americans, while they'll have peaceful protest, they will not give in, end up being arrested, and then trying to make change that way. And then we'll see later next week, we'll talk about some who wanted to take a more violent approach. But at the beginning here, there was a non-violent deal. We have another story it's called Brown versus the Board of Education, and this was a little girl, here she is, named Linda Brown, and she lived near this school. and wanted to go to school there because it was very close. But it was the white school. And so therefore she and her sister had to walk about a mile away to get to the African American school. And so her parents appealed to the law, and they said, listen, we live in this neighborhood. Our daughter should be able to go to this school. And the government said no. This is Alabama as well. The government said no, and they took the case to court. And so when we see this Brown v. Board of Education, that was taken to the Supreme Court of the United States, and they ruled in Linda Brown's favor that the biggest problem is that there wasn't equity between the white school and the black school, that they weren't equal. Ironically, in this particular case, her school that she was forced to walk to was actually a pretty good school, but that's beside the point. This was used kind of as a test case to try to move the laws along. And so now we're saying, yes, you cannot discriminate based on race on where they can go to school. Another case about schools was called what happened in Little Rock, Arkansas, and this was the idea of desegregation. Okay, so the Brown versus Board of Education said it was illegal to keep them from coming to that church, therefore segregating them into different races was not legal. And so this case is now being tested again in Little Rock. There were 9 students who wanted to go to the Little Rock High School, and they were, by law, by the Brown versus the Board of Education, they were allowed to do that, but they were harassed when they came in. So you can see people here like crowding around this poor girl and yelling at her. It's just awful to me that this really happened. And the local police just stood by and watched it take place and didn't do anything about it. And so it got so bad, they kept trying every day, this group of 9. This particular day, this girl showed up and she couldn't figure out why she was by herself. I think she went in a different door or something. The rest of the days, they stayed together as a group of 9 to go in. They were literally attacked in the school by some of the parents, actually, outside the school. And then in the school, they were attacked by some of the other students and ridiculed and this kind of thing. And the teachers didn't have any power or didn't take any power to try to keep them safe. And so finally, President Eisenhower had to send in the National Guard. So for the whole rest of the year, every single day, the National Guard had to walk these students to their classes. And they ended up finishing classes there, but it was showing a real courage on their part to keep going and finish school there. All right, meanwhile, for some better news right here, in 1959, Alaska became the 49th state. All right, and when that happened, of course, it became the largest state that we have. It surpasses Texas in its size. I'll show you right here. Look, so if we put Alaska over the continental United States, you see how massive it is. Okay, so it is huge. If you remember, it was purchased back in the 1860s, and people thought it was a ridiculous purchase, thinking it didn't make any sense, although they got it for a pretty good price, but it was huge. It turns out most people live in this part of Alaska because this is called the Aleutians down here. It's the more temperate areas. Up here it's very, very cold most of the year along. Okay, so but you know where it is, right? It's up above Canada. All right, I think I'll show you on the map in a minute. All right, Hawaii in 1959 also became the last of our states. So it's the 50th state. If you recall that it had been sort of taken over by a group of farmer-type guys who took the kingdom away from Liliuokalani, and now it had become sort of a colony, and now it has become a state. All right, also at this time, part of the Cold War also resulted in what is known as the space race. There was an arms race, which was building up weaponry, but there was also this space race. And that was the idea that we wanted to conquer the last frontier, the frontier of space, and we wanted to beat the Russians to the moon. If you remember that didn't we talk about Robert Goddard and the rockets breaking the gravitational pull and this kind of thing? So we had been experimenting with rockets. We had we brought the guy over from World War II, Werner von Braun, who was the Nazi rocket builder, and he's now working for a new government program called NASA, which is the National Aeronautic and Space Association. So the first round goes to the Russians. They won the first round of the space race because they actually put into orbit this little satellite called Sputnik. And all it was a silver ball that was launched up on a rocket and then went into orbit around the Earth. Now, it didn't do much except send out a radio beep. It beeped, and they could keep track of where it was, but it was in orbit around the Earth. It was the first time anything like this had been done. All right, and the United States started thinking, oh my goodness, we're so far behind. How did we ever let them beat us in this and this kind of thing? So that's when Eisenhower said, yes, we've got to work on this. So he created NASA. Here it is. So the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, so established in 1958. It is a government office, a government run group, but it is considered non-military. All right, so from the very beginning, they said we are not using space for war. We're using space to try to understand our universe better. Okay, it was more for education and for pursuing this last frontier for exploration ideas. So the first American in space was this man. His name is Alan Shepard. There were a group of guys who were being trained. They were called astronauts, and being trained for going up into space. And we're going to take it step by step. Now, I will say the Russians already, they won this battle too, because they already sent a man up into space. So Alan Shepard's not the first man in space. He's the first American in space. The first man in space was a Russian named Yuri Gagarin. And so they beat us on that one as well. But we're going to catch up pretty quickly here. So Alan Shepard goes up, and he sees he's out of the atmosphere and he's above in space, and then he came right back down. So that was the goal of his mission. That's what they were trying to do. So we started this thing called the Mercury program, and this idea was we're going to send up a guy that's going to go up a little longer. There were 7 astronauts in it, so that's why we called it the Mercury 7. Right here you can see the sign for Mercury and the number 7 in there, okay? And we see one guy in the little space capsule right there. So I don't know if we're going to get back to that. Oh, I think I will get back to that a little later today, talking about the first guy to get put in orbit was a guy named John Glenn, the first American in orbit. We also lost that one to the Russians. Yuri Gagarin also was the first man in orbit. All right, and Cold War news. On the Cold War front again, we have this guy. His name is Gary Powers. He was in the Army, and he was a pilot. And here we can see him with his famous airplane right here. It's called a U-2 spy plane. So he was actually spying on Russia when he was he got shot down and the wreckage came down. He bailed out and was okay, but he was captured as a prisoner. I have a video on this. Here we go.
U-2 incident. The Cold War, May 1st, 1960. In the 1950s, as tensions increased between the USA and the USSR, Khrushchev agreed to a summit meeting in Paris between the USSR, USA, Britain, and France in 1960. Hopes were high for a peaceful coexistence. It was hoped that the USSR and the USA would discuss the increasing tensions in Berlin and discuss the possibility of a nuclear test ban treaty. These hopes were shattered on May 1st, 1960, just 13 days before the summit, when an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over the USSR and its pilot, Gary Powers, captured. The U-2 was a sophisticated spy plane developed by the Americans, capable of top-secret reconnaissance because it could fly at very high altitudes of more than 13 miles above the ground, making it unreachable by Soviet jets and anti-aircraft missiles. They were, however, visible on Soviet radar. President Eisenhower had used the U-2 planes to gather intelligence on the Soviet nuclear missile capabilities, and over 4 years of unengaged spying discovered that the USA was ahead in this area. This time, the Soviets had a new surface-to-air missile that could reach the ranges of the U-2 spy plane. CIA pilot Gary Powers took off from a U.S. airbase in Pakistan towards the USSR, taking photos of military sites when the missiles locked on to his spy plane. The missile exploded near the plane, causing it to drop altitude. As another missile made a direct hit, Powers ejected over Soviet territory and was captured by Soviet forces. On May 5th, Khrushchev announced the downed American spy plane, but Eisenhower denied the plane's real mission, claiming it was a weather plane as a cover story. However, the Soviets had managed to recover the photos Powers had taken and wreckage evidence, proving that the aircraft was indeed for surveillance purposes. Khrushchev demanded an apology when Eisenhower had been caught lying. Khrushchev also wanted an end to unauthorized flights by U.S. aircraft over Soviet territory. Eisenhower refused to apologize. Now relations between the USA and USSR were again at a low. At the beginning of the talks on May 16th, Khrushchev walked out of the summit meeting hours before it started, withdrew his invitation for Eisenhower to visit the USSR, and abandoned talks for nuclear disarmament. Furthermore, as there were no talks on the problems in Berlin, the U-2 incident would lead to the Berlin Wall's construction. Gary Powers, meanwhile, was put on trial and sentenced to 10 years in prison in the Soviet Union. However, he was released in early 1962 when an exchange for a Soviet spy called Rudolf Abel took place between America and the Soviet Union.
All right, yeah, so it was definitely espionage stuff. So that prisoner exchange between Rudolf Abel and Powers took place on this bridge. And furthermore, they've made a movie about it called The Bridge of Spies. It came out just a couple years ago. It was very, very good. A little bit slow and long and complicated, but if you know the background and what's going on, it might be really interesting to you. It's got Tom Hanks in it, so. All right, there's Abel right there. He was a spy here in America, yeah. And that movie delves into that a little more to tell how he was a bad guy. Yeah, we don't talk about him too much. All right, also at this time we have this man making his mark. His name is Billy Graham. You've probably heard of him. He was a traveling evangelist, and he went around the country giving tent revivals. And what he would do was he would pitch a tent, and he would get up there and he would give a very, very persuasive talk about the salvation message of Jesus Christ. And because of, there was a little bit of the disillusion and the fear of the disillusion from the war, fear of the nuclear stuff, there were people who were searching for something more. They were searching for, something that was more than just this world and more than just America. And so they found it, of course, in Jesus Christ. And Billy Graham was very good at preaching, and he was also around for a long, long time. In fact, he only died maybe a year ago, or a year and a half, 2 years ago. So he did great work for the kingdom. We also have these guys who went out at this time in the 50s, to evangelize some of the unreached people of the world. So these guys are missionaries, and they were going to a place in the Amazon area, so in South America, to a tribe of people who had never been reached before by the gospel, or even by white man or Americans or anything like that. They were completely unvisited. And so they went out to go evangelize them. They lived down there. They made themselves a little camp area. They brought their wives and their children, and they were all there. Well, at one point, the guys went out to go meet with this tribe, and the tribe turned on them and actually killed all the men. So the men were killed by the tribe, and the women were okay and went back home. And years later, the wife of Jim Elliot, Elizabeth Elliot, went back and met with the people, and the people actually did get converted to Christianity. So there is a good news at the end of that story, but these guys were tragically killed. But they died as martyrs for the faith. There's a great movie about this. It's called The Tip of the Spear, I believe is the name of it. Made several years ago. Very, very good. I recommend that one. Now we have met this guy right here already. This is John F. Kennedy, and this is his family. So we met him last week when we looked at, or the week before last, maybe that's when it was, when we looked at the Pacific Theater of the War. Remember, he had a boat that he was on called the PT-109, and he had that heroic salvation of the people on there after the boat was wrecked by a Japanese boat that cut him in half and that kind of thing. And so, but this is the family, and they're kind of considered, you're going to see in your curriculum, that America sort of considered them royalty. Not that America had any royalty, but I will say that this family had met with a whole lot of tragedy that went on in their life. So the dad is right here. His name is Joseph P. Kennedy, married to Rose Kennedy, and they had their children. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 kids. They were a good Catholic family. So their firstborn right here, Rosemary, she had a little bit of a mental disability. We're not exactly sure what it was. She was able to read and write and this kind of thing, but she didn't process emotions very well. So she tended to act out and things like this. And Joe thought that was not very becoming of a Kennedy. And so he secretly, without his wife's knowledge, took her for a new procedure called a frontal lobotomy, where they actually separate the front part of your brain from the rest of your brain. That was supposed to be very good at regulating aggressive behaviors and that kind of thing. Well, it ended up turning her into putting her in a vegetative state. So she went into like a coma for the rest of her life. It was very difficult on Rose. I don't know if she ever forgave her husband for that. So that was their first tragedy. Their oldest son right here, Joe Jr., he was in the war and was killed on an airplane that was shot down. His sister Kik right here was in the war also. She was helping, I don't know if she was delivering messages or something, but she was shot down as well. So she was killed in the war. Then, of course, we have John right here, who was almost killed in the war, but came back and got the awards and this kind of thing and wrote the book. And then everybody else was quite a bit younger. I'm not sure if I know everyone's name. I know the baby. This is Edward, known as Teddy Kennedy. And this is Robert, his the brother in between. The girls, one of them is named Ethel. Yeah, I'm not sure of the rest of the girls' names. Okay. At this time, we have fast food that was developed in the McDonald's fast food chain. It was actually started by a couple of brothers. They were the McDonald brothers. But another guy came along, Ray Kroc, and he realized it was a moneymaker. He bought the franchise from them and then started putting them all over the country. And, of course, the rest is history, right? We've got them everywhere, these McDonald's. He made everything the same way. So it was all very systemized. It wasn't like, you ordered a specialty or anything like that. And it just took off, and people really enjoyed coming to get their burger. And at first it was just a walk-up window. I don't even think they had dine-in. You would sit out in your car and that kind of thing. But it has become an American icon. There have been times when I've tried to figure out a way to get, when we're having this lecture, have somebody bring us some McDonald's French fries or something, which would have been fun to do. All right, we're going to look at the art, music, and pop culture of the 50s, then we'll move into the 60s, okay? All right, this guy is Mark Rothko. He's a painter. He invented this thing called the color block method. And you can see right here, we just have colors in blocks, right? So you're thinking, wow, that's art? It looks like something I could do. I will tell you, these things are massive. They're very large pieces of art. And in his younger years, I think he had immigrated over here from Eastern Europe somewhere and became an American. And early in his life, he had these very colorful color block paintings. But as he got older, they got darker. Yeah, so it gets a little darker there. At the end of his life, it was really dark, right? Just gray and black like this. I don't think he was a very happy person. This guy I really like. He seems happier to me, Jasper Johns. I love that over there, that target on there. It's just fun, good, like Americana type stuff. And speak of Americana, this is one of his most famous pieces here. It's called Flags. I really like that one. Andrew Wyeth was part of a family of artists. So his father was a guy named N.C. Wyeth, who was also a painter, but Andrew kind of outstripped him as far as fame. His most famous painting is called Christina's World. That's the one you can see right here. They lived in, somewhere in the Midwest, and there was his house. This is Christina in the field. I used to always think, oh, look, she's just looking back at the house. Well, apparently this girl was crippled and had to crawl back to the house. So that takes a little bit of the beauty out of it for me. But it has become quite a famous painting for him. All right, we have baseball, Jackie Robinson. You know what, y'all? Out of this, I left out one guy. Did I? No. Okay, I think I put him in a different time. Okay, Jackie Robinson made a big move in baseball. And what it happened was that he was really good at playing baseball, and there were baseball managers who saw that and asked him to be part of the team. So who is it? Boston, I guess? Even though he was African American. So he is the first black man to break that barrier and become part of the big leagues. And after this, there's going to be the floodgate open when the baseball owners start to see, well, we like winning baseball games more than anything else, and so we're going to get players, I don't care what color they are, come on our team and come play for us. So Jackie Robinson was smashed kind of through the race barrier there. His number was 42, and to this day people honor the number 42 for Jackie Robinson. I don't think anybody wears it themselves. Lots of people wear it, but only on special days when they're honoring Jackie Robinson. TV was very prevalent. More and more people are getting television sets. We can see here, it's a very small box with a black and white picture, right? Probably not very good sound quality and stuff, but there were some productions of TV shows. Remember, they listened to radio before this, and now they're listening to watching TV. And this is going to take kind of a hit put kind of a hit on the movie industry. And so the movies are going to have to do things to draw people in. They'll get bigger and splashier and that kind of thing in the 50s, you know, big color, spectric vision and this kind of stuff. Here's one TV show that's probably, to this day, is still classic. I Love Lucy. That's Lucille Ball. She was actually a famous movie actress. Maybe not in the biggest films, but in some films she did really well. She's actually a really good actress, but what it turned out, she had wonderful comic timing. And so she's very funny to watch. Even if you watch some of these shows now, they really do hold up over time. Here's one of the famous scenes. This is just a little gif here of they're trying to get the chocolates wrapped, right? And it just starts going faster and faster. Yeah, one of the classic scenes with her friend, so Lucy and her friend Ethel. Rock and roll became big. It really kind of was a growth out of the jazz music that had started really, you know, in the Harlem Renaissance and all that kind of thing. This guy probably doesn't get as much credit as he should. His name is Little Richard, and he sort of, and I think he claimed to start rock and roll, but he certainly was very, very influential at the very beginning. It's possible, I know that he became a preacher later in life, and he might actually still be alive. If not, he just died recently. Chuck Berry, another African-American who really could rock and roll. He played a really mean guitar right there. This is him doing his little skip dance thing that was so popular. Jerry Lee Lewis took it says rock and roll meets country. He was a country boy, kind of a bumpkin, really. Really good piano player, amazing piano player. Goodness Gracious, Great Balls of Fire is one of the songs he did. And he really took the African American style and made it his own, and so that really has taken off there. Patsy Cline, speaking of country western, she was a great country western artist. Sadly, she was killed in a plane crash at the height of her career, but her voice is just amazing. You know, one of her songs is called Crazy, and you may have heard it. Very good. Johnny Cash was at this time. He had a kind of a tumultuous life. I think he spent some time in jail, and he used all that to inform his music, his kind of country music. And then he married one of the country music royalty. Okay, this is June Carter from the Carter family, who were big country western singers. So she became June Carter Cash. Buddy Holly was from Texas. All right, he was from Midland, Texas, and there he is down there singing. He had, you would know his music too. Peggy Sue is one of the famous ones. He was kind of this straight-laced guy. Sadly, once again, died in a plane crash. They call it the day the music died, where he and two other singers, a guy named Richie Valens and the Big Bopper, who sang Chantilly Lace and a Funny Face. They were on this plane. They were traveling from somewhere where it was very cold, and they got on the plane, and there was ice on the wings, and it went down in a field and crashed, and they were all three killed that day. And much later, somebody wrote a song called "The Day the Music Died." It was called "American Pie." Yeah, that was after this this crash right here. The most famous is obviously Elvis. Here he is with his guitar, right? He definitely took the black sound and made it his own. So he mixed that country and rock together. Let's watch a little one of his. This is one of his famous ones. The quality of this is not great, but it is actually him. It's sort of a very early music video.
Hey, pick up on this!
so that's Jailhouse Rock, obviously. And a lot of the parents were very alarmed because of the way he danced and the way he moved himself around like that. They thought that it was immoral. Yeah, so he was not popular with the grown-ups. All right, so that brings us into the 60s. A lot of that entertainment stuff would come into the 60s. And of course, Eisenhower was president in 1960, but there was going to be an election. All right, we call this era of time the Cultural Revolution. So this is actually next week's deal. But the Cultural Revolution is when there's kind of this big paradigm shift in the way that people are responding to the past. Okay, so where tradition was always so strong before this, now we have some reaction against tradition, moving out on their own, this kind of thing. So young people who have decided that their parents may not be the smartest around. Okay, so they start looking for their own way in the world. That's going to be mostly in the 60s and the 70s. So we'll finish the part about the Cultural Revolution next week. So there is an election in 1960. Richard Nixon, this man here, was the vice president under Eisenhower. And so he's going to run for president. It's kind of a normal thing for vice presidents to do. And then we have John F. Kennedy, of course, was part of that quote-unquote royalty. He had that heroic status from World War II. He also had written a book called Profiles in Courage about other people and how courageous they were. So he was young. He was handsome. He wasn't that much younger than Nixon. I think like 2 years or a year or something like that. But he seemed so fresh and exciting. And so it was a very, very close election, but they did have a televised debate. So there were a couple of the things that sort of put things over in the court of John Kennedy. He had a disadvantage. The disadvantage he had was he was Catholic. And so there had never been a Catholic president elected before in our country, and most people saw it as a detriment. But Kennedy didn't shy away from it. He said that's how he was raised, and he was okay with that, right? But they had this debate on TV, and during the debate, the lights were hot. When you're on TV, they have a lot of lights so they can see you, and they're very hot. And so Nixon was sweating a lot. Here we see him wiping sweat from his mouth. And look at Kennedy. He looked cool as a cucumber, looked really, great. And so he came off as being this composed, whereas Nixon came off sort of being nervous and sweaty, right? So it worked against him. So it did result in the election for John F. Kennedy. It was a squeaker of a election. It wasn't super, I have the stats here. There he is with his wife, however, at a parade or whatever. That's Jacqueline Kennedy. And she was also young and beautiful and like a trendsetter. So here are the stats right here. You can see that it was 49.6 for Nixon and 49.7 for Kennedy. So very, very close. Electorally, a little more right here. And maybe this problem here with the Dixiecrats, this guy's name was Richard Byrd, who was running, and he won a little bit over here. That could have been swung over. I don't know if it would have made a difference at all. But I will say that there was a little bit of an issue and concern that there had been a little cheating going on. And that had to do mostly with John F. Kennedy's father, Joe. Joe P. Kennedy was a little bit of a shady character. He had made most of his wealth in running alcohol. He was a bootlegger, and so he had made money that way. So he had kind of a shady past. And there was probably, we look at it today, there was probably some pretty good indication that there had been some cheating in the voting in particular states that would throw those electoral votes that way. And Nixon knew about it. Some people encouraged Nixon to pursue some sort of investigation, but Nixon said, no, it's not good for the country. I'm just going to go ahead and step aside. So he sort of, magnanimously stepped and went back to California where he was from. All right, so number 35 is John F. Kennedy. Here he is, young, vigorous, with a young family. Oh, I'm sorry, that word is messed up right there. That word says Camelot. It's over his face, and it shouldn't be. The idea here was that Camelot is the story about King Arthur and his knights. There was a stage play at the time known as Camelot. It was a musical on stage, and the couple loved going to see that. And somebody labeled them as, Camelot. So once again, that idea of royalty associated with the Kennedys. We don't have royalty in America. Don't want royalty in America, but they sort of had this this allure to them. You know, they just seemed so exciting and fresh. And everybody was real excited about this young couple. They had young children in the White House. Here we can see the president at his desk. And look, peeking out from that door right there. How cute is that? That's little John Kennedy Jr. Most people called him John. I don't know if his family called him that, but there he is. And then his wife, like I said, was a trendsetter. Anything she wore became fashion news, right? Everybody wanted to dress like Jackie Kennedy was dressed. Here she is, this pillbox hat right here. She made that very popular. And just some really beautiful dresses and stuff that she wore to state functions. She was also responsible for getting the White House completely redecorated, and she actually took one of the TV programs, you know, ABC News or something, through it and explained to them how she was doing redecorating, and it endeared her to the people of America, being so open like that. One of the first things that Kennedy wanted to do was, in order to try to make amends, I guess, and try to keep the communism from forming around the world, is he wanted to do something positive. And so he got this guy who was his brother-in-law. His name was Sargent, that's his first name, Sargent Shriver, and was married, I think, to his sister Eunice. I'm pretty sure, did I say Ethel earlier? Eunice, yeah. And so they started this thing called the Peace Corps. And the Peace Corps was a voluntary deal where young people, unmarried, would volunteer to go over to other countries and help them with mostly infrastructure, building roads, building bridges, and trying to make those countries better, right? So that they wouldn't fall to communism, essentially. So these are the places over the world. You can see the dark blue places are we had a big presence there. So a lot in Africa right here, down here in Central America, Mexico, and in some in South America, over here in China. Yeah, so we had a lot of people sent to these areas. I guess there was a presence in these other lighter blue areas, although I find it interesting that Russia is colored right there. So, so the idea was to foster some sort of good relationships between these underdeveloped countries and America, so we could make an influence on them versus the communists making an influence on them. Let's watch a little video about it.
Interest in President Kennedy's proposed Peace Corps continues to rise among American youth. Here are the forerunners of the Peace Corps, American exchange students, now overseas in backward and depressed areas of the world, giving of their strength, skills, and education in tasks similar to the missions that will be assigned to Peace Corps members. Popular response to the Peace Corps proposal, with thousands of inquiries pouring in before application forms were even ready, is a measure of the younger generation's readiness to accept a bold challenge to positive action. Now, following up his initial announcement, President Kennedy appears before newsreel cameras in the White House to outline the program and the prospects of the global Peace Corps.
The Peace Corps is really the idea of the American people. When I talked last fall about the idea of young American men and women going abroad to serve shoulder to shoulder with the citizens of newly emerging countries, a tremendous response went up from the schools and colleges of the United States. In the last few months, more applications for the Peace Corps have come to us than have come for positions in all the rest of the United States government put together. What is remarkable is that there is no salary for the members of the Peace Corps. They will go abroad and live on the same standard as people of other countries, but they will work with them 2 or 3 years, devoting part of their lives to peace and to strengthening the ties that bind men together all over the globe, who are capable and well-trained, and who will be welcomed by other countries. Our Peace Corps, I want to emphasize, is not designed as a weapon of propaganda, is not designed as a tool in the Cold War. It is a genuine effort by the people of the United States, particularly those who are young, to play their part in working for peace, in improving the lives of all mankind. It comes, I think, from a deep, historic, and revolutionary experience that we have had. The people of this country are anxious to see a world in peace. Young people in this country are anxious to hold out their hands to people in other worlds. They will learn as much as they will teach.
Okay, so you get the idea there, yeah. So the Cold War is still plenty cold. Here we have Kennedy, and this guy's name is Nikita Khrushchev over in Russia. All right, we saw in that video right earlier that the beginning of the building of the Berlin Wall took place. So let's go back to Berlin real quick. So remember, Berlin is smack in the middle of East Germany, right? So, and we had East Berlin and West Berlin. So this is West Berlin, the French sector, English sector, and American sector. Then we have the Russian, but everything is surrounded by East Germany. So the wall, look, is built all the way around. That's a big wall. Okay, so they completely cordoned off this sector altogether. Remember at the beginning of this, with Stalin, he tried to keep them from getting in and out of the place, and we sent the planes in to drop food to them and stuff like this. Well, now we can see that they're going to cordon this off this way. So the only way to get in and out is by airplane. Right here in number 1 is called Checkpoint Charlie. That happened to be the gate where the Americans came in. Let's hear a little bit about it.
The Berlin Wall, 1961 to 1989. The Cold War. The Berlin Wall would become a symbol of ideological division and suppression of human rights during the Cold War. In August 1961, the communist government of the German Democratic Republic of East Germany began construction of the wall and placement of barbed wire between West Berlin and the East. Its purpose was to stop Western fascists from entering the socialist state of East Germany and stopping defections from East to West. It would continue to do so until November 9, 1989, when the East German regime announced that its citizens had the right to cross the border when they wanted. The wall goes up. When World War II came to an end in 1945, the victors came together at the Yalta and Potsdam Conference to split Germany into 4 Allied occupation zones. East Germany would go to the Soviet Union, while the western part went to the United States, Great Britain, and France. Even though Berlin was located entirely within the Soviet part of the country, the city would be split into 4 sectors in the same way. The Russians were determined to remove the United States, Britain, and France from Berlin. A Soviet blockade in 1948 attempted to starve them from the city. However, the United States and its allies resisted by dropping food and fuel supplies from aircraft, which became known as the Berlin Airlift. The booming western sector, which was the showcase of capitalism, contrasted sharply to the economically poorer east. Many German refugees flowed from east to west, including highly skilled workers such as doctors, teachers, and engineers. Between 1945 to 1961, 15 to 20% of the East German population had left to the west. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, leader of the Soviet Union, had had enough and gave the East German government permission to close the Berlin borders for good. On the night of August 12 through 13, 1961, East German soldiers, the police force, and volunteer construction workers laid down barbed wire and a concrete block wall which stretched over 100 miles. Escaping East Berlin. Berliners would no longer be able to cross freely with ease to work, shop, or go to the cinema as they had done before. Now, in order to get from east to west, they had to pass through one of 3 checkpoints. Checkpoints Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. In October 1961, U.S. Chief of Mission in West Berlin, E. Allen Leitner, was stopped in his car by East German police. This prevention of access for American officials to East Berlin caused a standoff between American and Soviet tanks, which faced off at Checkpoint Charlie. For many hours, both sides stared each other down, waiting for the enemy to fire. The potential for World War III was eventually averted when President John F. Kennedy contacted Nikita Khrushchev and convinced him to withdraw his tanks. The American tanks also backed away soon after. Armed soldiers patrolled the wall and would shoot anyone on sight attempting to escape. Ditches, barbed wire, guard dogs, searchlights, and minefields were all also set up to prevent escape attempts. Buildings overlooking the wall were demolished or had their windows bricked up so that people could not escape by jumping from them. At least 171 people were killed trying to cross the wall. But this didn't mean escape was impossible. Hundreds of East Germans tried to escape across the wall, including by flying a hot air balloon, by zipline, on a tightrope, in a car without a windshield, by swimming, and through a tunnel. While President John F. Kennedy protested, he realized a wall was better than war. The Berlin Wall had diffused tension and stopped the flow of refugees from East Berlin. The fall of the wall. On November 9th, 1989, with the Cold War thawing and political changes happening across...
We're going to skip skip that part because it's going to happen later, and we'll talk about that next week. Okay. All right, so Kennedy, this was not good for his administration. It wasn't good that the Cold War, instead of getting better, it was getting colder. And so we already had the problem with the spy plane that was shot down, and now he's got this, Berlin Wall going up. And so he's trying to show a strength. And so he goes to visit West Berlin to support them. And he gave a speech. Those of you who have better German than mine, it's Ich bin ein Berliner. And he's basically saying, I am a Berliner. I'm like you. I'm one of you type of thing. But it turns out the word Berliner also refers to a pastry. And so he kind of said, I am a jelly donut. All right. So this guy seems to be laughing at it right there. Yeah, but they knew what he meant. It was just one of those language things. All right. So the Cold War is still going on here. A little closer to home, we have this island of Cuba right here. Remember Cuba from the Spanish-American War. Remember, we helped Cuba get their independence from Spain, and in so doing, they got their independence, but left us a little, right down here, Guantanamo Bay, they left to us, and so we still own it today. Well, there was a revolution in Cuba, and it was a communist revolution. This guy is named Fidel Castro. He came in and talked to people that were very poor, and the government was corrupt and wasn't doing well, and the people were, not doing well. So he was able to easily talk them into a revolution to overthrow the government of Cuba and take over as a communist government. Well, this was very alarming to the Americans. Look how close Cuba is to Florida. Very, very close. Furthermore, there were people in Cuba who were wealthy, so they had sort of a wealthy class and then a poor class, no, not really a middle class. Those wealthy people realized this communist revolution was just going to take all their stuff from them, so they decided to leave. A lot of them ran and came to Florida, Miami in particular. There's still to this day a very large Cuban population in Miami and in parts of Florida, and they are extremely anti-communist, as you can see here, that they would be that way. So there's Guantanamo Bay right down on this end right here. So at this time, there was an idea. So a new government group was forming. What is it called? It's called the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. And then we already had the FBI, which is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And so the CIA, if I'm not remembering this incorrectly, the CIA was in charge of foreign problems, where the FBI was for domestic problems. So the CIA came up with an idea that they floated over to the president. They said, what if we take some of those Cuban refugees who came over to Florida and help them invade Cuba and take it back? Okay, so we call it the Bay of Pigs because that's what the little area is called. So the CIA secretly trained them and then moved them in through Central America, it's not South America, Central America, and then they invaded from Puerto Rico and from Nicaragua this way. And they did have an invasion, but Castro was ready, and he met them with quite a force, and they were a complete failure, and it was not good. They were all taken prisoner, and later were put in jail there. Some of them were expatriated back to Florida, but a lot of them, spent a lot of time there, so we're not going to watch that video. And meanwhile, Castro has a new friend. That's Nikita Khrushchev of Russia, because now all of a sudden he's been invaded by Americans. It was very clear that these guys, in fact, I think they had given that information to them while they were in prison, had been backed by the American government, by this new agency called the Central Intelligence Agency. And so Fidel Castro said, well, that's no good. I need to get my communist buddy up in Russia to help me. And so he did. And this is getting worse, right? Even worse. So there were some shipments from Russia to Cuba with things like food and that kind of thing. But then we noticed we had an airplane fly over, a spy plane, and we noticed something. And what it was they were missile sites. They were sites for missiles to go in. It would be like looking at a giant garage. And they knew that that type of building was holding missiles. And so all of a sudden, Americans realized, oh my goodness, the Russians are putting possibly nuclear missiles right next to Florida. Oh my goodness, terrible. That could reach anywhere in the United States. This came the closest we have ever been to nuclear war. It was really close. It's called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And here is the president and his brother. He had made his brother, Robert Kennedy, he's in his cabinet. Let me think for a second. He is the Attorney General of his cabinet. And they're trying to figure out what to do. They're exchanging letters. They're trying diplomacy. Let's watch a little movie about it. The first thing they did was to put in a new, what do you call that? Naval blockade. A naval blockade. So ships that would keep any other Russian ships from coming in. But a naval blockade is quite provocative. Here we see they're both sitting on bombs, each with their hand on a button. That's how close everything is. Here's the little video on it.
It's not hard to imagine a world where at any given moment, you and everyone you know could be wiped out without warning, at the push of a button. This was the reality for millions of people during the 45-year period after World War II, now known as the Cold War. As the United States and Soviet Union faced off across the globe, each knew that the other had nuclear weapons capable of destroying it. And destruction never loomed closer than during the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1961, the U.S. unsuccessfully tried to overthrow Cuba's new communist government. That failed attempt was known as the Bay of Pigs, and it convinced Cuba to seek help from the USSR. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was happy to comply by secretly deploying nuclear missiles to Cuba, not only to protect the island, but to counteract the threat from U.S. missiles in Italy and Turkey. By the time U.S. intelligence discovered the plan, the materials to create the missiles were already in place. At an emergency meeting on October 16, 1962, military advisors urged an airstrike on missile sites and invasion of the island. But President John F. Kennedy chose a more careful approach. On October 22nd, he announced that the U.S. Navy would intercept all shipments to Cuba. There was just one problem. A naval blockade was considered an act of war. Although the president called it a quarantine that did not block basic necessities, the Soviets didn't appreciate the distinction. In an outraged letter to Kennedy, Khrushchev wrote, "The violation of freedom to use international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression which pushes mankind toward the abyss of world nuclear missile war." Thus ensued the most intense 6 days of the Cold War. While the U.S. demanded the removal of the missiles, Cuba and the USSR insisted they were only defensive. And as the weapons continued to be armed, the U.S. prepared for a possible invasion. On October 27th, a spy plane piloted by Major Rudolf Anderson was shot down by a Soviet missile. The same day, a nuclear-armed Soviet submarine was hit by a small depth charge from a U.S. Navy vessel trying to signal it to come up. The commanders on the sub, too deep to communicate with the surface, thought war had begun and prepared to launch a nuclear torpedo. That decision had to be made unanimously by 3 officers. The captain and political officer both authorized the launch, but Vasily Arkhipov, second in command, refused. His decision saved the day, and perhaps the world. But the crisis wasn't over. For the first time in history, the U.S. military set itself to DEFCON 2, the defense readiness one step away from nuclear war. With hundreds of nuclear missiles ready to launch, the metaphorical doomsday clock stood at 1 minute to midnight. But diplomacy carried on. In Washington, D.C., Attorney General Robert Kennedy secretly met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. After intense negotiation, they reached the following proposal. The U.S. would remove their missiles from Turkey and Italy and promise to never invade Cuba in exchange for the Soviet withdrawal from Cuba under UN inspection. Once the meeting had concluded, Dobrynin cabled Moscow, saying time is of the essence and we shouldn't miss the chance. And at 9 a.m. the next day, a message arrived from Khrushchev announcing the Soviet missiles would be removed from Cuba. The crisis was now over. While criticized at the time by their respective governments for bargaining with the enemy, contemporary historical analysis shows great admiration for Kennedy and Khrushchev's ability to diplomatically solve the crisis. But the disturbing lesson was that a slight communication error or split-second decision by a commander could have thwarted all their efforts, as it nearly did, if not for Vasily Arkhipov's courageous choice. The Cuban Missile Crisis revealed just how fragile human politics are compared to the terrifying power they can unleash.
Wow, that was really close stuff. All right, but Kennedy did continue with the space race after Eisenhower here, and he gave a really important speech, and he said, we would like, this is in 1962, he said we would like to get a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Boy, that was really laying down the gauntlet right there to say to get there in the 60s. So we're going to up the ante here at NASA, Project Gemini. So remember we had Project Mercury, and that was one guy, and that was John Glenn going up to orbit the Earth. And now we have Project Gemini, which is the twins. We have two men in the capsule right here, and they're going to go up into space, orbit the Earth, and do a couple things. This guy is named Ed White, and he did the first space walk. So he actually was in a spacesuit outside of the capsule and taking pictures and this kind of thing. You can actually see the camera right there. And so that was a big step forward in the space race. And we'll finish the space race, I guess, next week. Or not, yeah, we'll talk about the moon landing. Containment, this was still a problem. There was still the idea that communism was bad. And in the area known as Indochina, there were several countries there that were in danger of going communist. So this is Indochina right down here, this little peninsula right here, including Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, I guess even Thailand and Burma to some extent. It had been under the auspices of France prior to the war, and then the Japanese came in and took it. And then there was a little bit of the separation, kind of like North and South Korea. North and South Vietnam had sort of arisen, so that North Vietnam was communist and South Vietnam was not. So here we have Kennedy talking about how there was a problem. The North Vietnamese were starting to invade South Vietnam, but they were actually coming through Laos. It turns out they were on a trail right here, which is known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Ho Chi Minh was the name of the leader of the communists in North Vietnam. I think he was not elected at first, but then he was like a figurehead, and then he became elected, I think, later. And he's kind of going to be behind that. And so here's Kennedy saying we need to deal with these communists going through Laos and coming into South Vietnam. And so he sent some guys out. We called them advisors. The French were there and said, please come help us. And so we went over to help the French, but then the French left us there. But it was Kennedy who put the first soldiers on the ground in Vietnam, and that's going to escalate after his death. The president was this man. His name was Diem, and he was a Catholic, which was kind of weird because in this country most of the people were Buddhist. And so here he was putting like Catholic type laws onto the people, and they were very dissatisfied with him. They were very unhappy with him. But remember, he is the president of South Vietnam, so he's the good guy here. But the people were starting to turn against him, and that made the Kennedy administration very, very nervous that the people would invite the communists to come down. And so there was an idea about a military coup. And so the coup was supported by the American government, but sadly, so here we have Kennedy. Sadly, these people, the military, who they abducted Diem, President Diem, and they ended up killing him. So he was assassinated. So some people pin his assassination on Kennedy. I don't know that that's really fair. He didn't know they were going to assassinate him, but he was very much informed about the coup that took place and actually supported that. So his policies are not great at this point, right? He did make some moves in civil rights. Right here he said, this nation was founded by men of many nations and backgrounds. It was founded on the principle that all men are created equal and that the rights of every man are diminished when the rights of one man are threatened. And so he tried to make some moves that way to calm that down. But we had all sorts of trouble going on. This is Medgar Evers. I'm sorry, his name is cut off right here. Hold on, let me go fix it real quick. Okay, there it is. There he is. He was from Mississippi. He had grown up there, and he'd gone off to actually be in the war. He was in the D-Day invasion and was a hero, just like the rest of them over there. And when he was there, he noticed how everybody got along, and they didn't really seem to make much, fuss about race so much. So, but when he came home to Mississippi, and it was still very, divided, and there was hatred and stuff, it made him very upset. And so he became part of the NAACP and started sending out flyers to different people, to different businesses, to honor, blacks to be part of their business, and made speeches. And he became very unpopular with the local KKK groups, and he was assassinated. Very sad. We're going to see that quite over and over again. We have here Martin Luther King Jr., who became the leader of this resistance. It was a type of resistance that was non-violent. We're going to listen to a little bit of the famous speech that he gave. I think you'll be reading it this week.
I have a dream that my poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. One day.
So it was a great speech. He was giving it in Washington, D.C. He was standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. And so the death of Medgar Evers gave life to this. So other people in the country were saying, oh, this is wrong that this happened. And they started to see the plight and started to support a little more, just little baby steps going toward this. And this man was a big part of it right there. Which brings us to 1963. This is November. And Kennedy was going to go shore up his support in Texas. So he decided to travel to Dallas. He had chosen as his vice presidential running mate, and who was vice president, a man from Texas named Lyndon Baines Johnson. And Johnson said, you need to come down to Texas and get those Texans supporting you. Because the Texans, while they were Democrat and happy to vote Democrat, they were a little shaky on his northeastern Catholic business, this kind of thing. So he was going to come down. He landed in Dallas. He was having a luncheon in Dallas, and then he was going to make his way to Austin for dinner. He didn't make it. Here they are in a parade route going through Dallas. You can see he and his wife in the open car here. This is the governor of Texas, a man named John Conley, John Conley's wife, and then we have a Secret Service agent and a driver right up here. All right. Little did they know that this crazy man was in this building called the Texas School Book Depository with a gun. And he assassinated the president that day. This is a picture, a still taken from a famous film that a man was standing and watching the parade go by, and he had his little home camera. It happened to be a color camera, and he took pictures. His name was Zapruder, Mr. Zapruder, and his footage was confiscated by the government because it showed the entire thing. Right here you can see what is known as something called the magic bullet, where a bullet came down through the president's neck right here and into Governor Conley. So we're going to watch actually a little deal on that in just a minute. This is very sad. A second shot came in. So Conley's down here. His wife is right there. The president is right there. Here comes Jackie coming to get the Secret Service agent, who will crawl onto the car to help them. The car's taken off and going to the hospital. All right, so the car had been driving along Houston Street, and it took a turn right here, and it's driving down here, and this is where the shot rang out. Okay, so here's the Texas School Book Depository where Lee Harvey Oswald was. He's shooting down this way with his sniper rifle. And then we can see Zapruder, the guy taking the video, is taking it from right here. I'm thinking this sign must have gotten in the way at some point. And right here is a little area, just right under here, something known as the grassy knoll. All right, that's going to become important when it gets to the controversies. Let's watch a little video.
U.S. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy's visit to Dallas, Texas on November the 22nd, 1963 was aimed at boosting his re-election bid ahead of the 1964 presidential vote. Thousands turned out to see the iconic leader and his wife Jacqueline travel in a motorcade through downtown Dallas. At 12:30 p.m. local time, as the president's open-top limousine reached Dealey Plaza, 3 gunshots were fired at the convoy. 2 bullets hit the president, 1 wounded him at the back of the neck and throat, the other caused a massive and fatal head injury. The president was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. in an historic announcement that stunned America. A government investigation found the shots were fired from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository by 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald. But the suspect was never tried. 2 days later, he was shot dead by local cabaret owner Jack Ruby during a prison transfer. The fact the identity of Kennedy's assassin was never proven in the courts has given rise to various alternative and unproven theories as to what really happened and who may have been behind it. A House of Representatives report in 1979 concluded there was a high possibility that 2 gunmen were involved.
Single bullet theory is all about what it does after it emerges from Kennedy's neck. Does it remain intact? Is it deflected? What happens to its velocity?
Well, a bullet normally flies true and straight. When this bullet emerged from Kennedy or any ballistic medium such as you saw a moment ago, it's now yawing and tumbling. And the entry wound in Conley is very important because it's the consequence of a yawed bullet. So it had to be a destabilized bullet from somewhere.
So you do believe, Mike, that it was just one bullet?
As far as the neck wound to the president and then the wounds to Governor Connolly, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that was 2 videos put together right there talking about this whole magic bullet theory. And these people who showed that little video right there showed how it indeed was possible. Governor Connolly, by the way, was not killed. He survived that day and later on became a Republican. Yeah. So here's Lee Harvey Oswald. They caught him about an hour later. I think he was in some sort of movie theater. He had walked out of the school book depository unnoticed, really, because of the panic that was going on. And they found him and arrested him. I think he got roughed up a little bit on the way in to the police station. A couple days later, they were going to transfer him from one place in Dallas to like a jail or something like this. And that's when Jack Ruby stepped up and just walked right up to him and shot him. That's actual photo right there. And he shot and killed him. So the sad part here is that we never got to get any kind of confession from Lee Harvey Oswald. We don't know what he had to say, what was his main reason for what he did. Jack Ruby went to jail for killing Oswald, and 4 years later he died without ever telling the reason why. Most people believed he was a patriot who loved John F. Kennedy and was mad at somebody who had killed him. That was the easy story, right? He was a bar owner and kind of a little bit of a shady character, so some people thought he might be part of the mob or something like this. And so some people actually believed that Lee Harvey Oswald had been hired by organized crime, what we call the mob, the mafia, and that he was going to talk, and Jack Ruby went and killed him before he could talk. We don't have any of that. We don't know any of that. What we do know is that we're pretty sure 3 shots were fired. They were fired from Lee Harvey Oswald's gun. The gun was capable of doing the magic bullet theory. It was an easy gun to fire, even if you weren't a very successful, a very good sniper type. Although he had been trained, he had been in the Army. Harvey Oswald was a communist. He didn't like America at all. And so probably the best story as to who killed John F. Kennedy, it probably was Lee Harvey Oswald. They listened to the audio tape from police officers' radios at the time, and people really feel like there was a 4th shot fired, possibly from that grassy knoll area. But some people believe that 4th shot that they hear is actually an echo. We don't know. It might be an interesting thing to ask your parents, ask your grandparents, their thoughts on that. Did they think that it was Lee Harvey Oswald that killed Kennedy, or did they think in some other theory? Another theory is that Castro from Cuba sent an assassin up there, or he talked Harvey Oswald, who was a communist, into doing it. Some people believe Lyndon Johnson was behind it. I can't take myself there. Speaking of Lyndon Johnson, here he is. He was in Dallas, of course, at the time, just in a different car. And here they are on the airplane, on Air Force One, and LBJ, that's what we call him, LBJ, is taking the oath of office because the president has been declared dead. Look, there's Jacqueline Kennedy right there. She's got blood on her dress down there. The president is in a coffin in the bottom of the plane. It's just horrible. It's awful. The whole country went into mourning. Here we have the funeral. Look at little John saluting his dad. There's his brothers right there. This is Caroline, his daughter. And the whole country just mourned. Even if people didn't vote for, remember there was a very close election, even if they hadn't voted for him, nobody wanted this to happen. And so he is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. He has the right, being president, to do that, but also he was a soldier, right? And he was a hero. And that's who gets buried in Arlington. He has the eternal flame at his grave marker. It's always kept so that there's always a flame burning right there. And then Lyndon Johnson becomes the next president, so president number 36. We'll talk about him more next time. He's a Texan, and we'll see that he was a very political man, all right? So he trusted politics a lot. I will real quickly tell you about his wife, Lady Bird. That's not her real name, Lady Bird Johnson, so she had the initials LBJ as well. But she was a wonderful first lady. She was responsible for the planting of bluebonnets along the highways in Texas. She always believed the highways needed to be colored by those beautiful bluebonnets. So when you drive down the highway and see those bluebonnets, you can always remember it was Lady Bird Johnson who's responsible for that. Okay, in 1964, Johnson will run. So this was 63 that the assassination took place. So he was president for a year. In 64, he's going to run against this very, very conservative man named Barry Goldwater. And the campaign was ruthless. He accused Goldwater of being somebody who wanted to have nuclear war and all this kind of stuff. And yikes! And you can see here that that LBJ won pretty handily, especially in the electoral vote. All right, so it was a pretty much of a landslide. They called him Landslide Lyndon. So he's going to be our president. So we'll talk about him more next time, and then what happened in the later 60s and in the 1970s. Okay, gang. Talk to you real soon.